about it in two distinct ways. Like if I'm coming up with a character, sometimes a character will just be in my head and I'm like, oh, hello, who are you? What do you want to do? So that will be a kind of intuitive, what does this character look like? And then I'll like doodle and kind of try and carve out who they are. But if I'm creating a character specifically for like something that someone else wants me to do, I'm like, okay, I'm going to mood board. I'm going to gather things I like to look at because I'll have an image in my head of the kind of thing I want to do, but I need reference to look at that's remembered this is what we're trying to do, because otherwise I'll just end up drawing something totally different. So it's a little bit more planned, and then I might do character profile. And I think because in my workshops I lay it out that when you're coming up with a story, you should ask yourself all these questions, and I kind of use that for myself as well, because it just helps, like whatever helps kind of tease information out of you is really useful.
This is more from running workshops and attending workshops on development of a narrative. But I think the most important thing with a character, whatever media, is to think about the small things, the things that no one knows about them, the things that they hate carrots or something like that, or maybe something in their past that's not like the dramatic thing, but maybe they were, I don't know, really good at football, played football for the local area, something like that, the unexpected things. I think it's about, so when you're developing a character, it's not two-dimensional, it's beyond how they look visually, it's also their whole backstory, who their friends are, what they like to eat, what their day looks like. So you're really trying to put yourself in their shoes, and it's their fears and their irritations, the things they hate, that is important to try and understand that first. And then the visual thing is also to just keep checking. You start with the drawing and then amend it so that you're avoiding visual stereotypes if possible. I don't know, there's some that we need to rely on for communicating quickly, but an awareness.
So a lot of my characters tend to be fairly based in reality. Well, in some ways. So like my first Commando was about a real train explosion that happened. But I thought, what if we put a twist on it and it was actually, it was an accident. It was no one's fault. But I said, what if it was a sabotage mission that was successful? So we changed where it was and added, that kind of sabotage-y aspect. And for me, it was important that my first Commando have a woman. And I thought, what better way to introduce the readers to a woman than to have her be a bad lady? So I had her be the saboteur. And then I had more female heroes or adjacent people. But for me, a lot of it, especially with like historical comics, is delving into that real history. So even like Women's Tune, all of the women in that are based off of real women in the suffrage movement. And even some of the names are going for that. So it's the same in the Commandos. It's finding an anchor in a real person and changing some things about them. Iron Resistance comic, it was based off of the story of two real women who were French saboteurs in the French Resistance, and then just tweaking the story or only focusing on one key bit. Yeah, so I'd say mine is basing it in reality and then fine-tuning it a little bit. So even in like the Love Ranch, some of it is based off of 80s TV shows or characters that I knew kind of growing up in the rodeo world and stuff like that, and just kind of twisting them. So yeah, I like real feeling characters. So I think that's why I root it in reality. Maybe one day I can create an original character, but right now, probably not. That's not my wheelhouse. Yeah, I like the real aspect.
I really enjoy character creation, especially the visual drawing and figuring out how they look, because it's basically like just playing dress up, except you're doing the entirety of a person or a thing or a monster or whatever. Monsters being my favourite, I really like designing monsters. But I think the thing I often kind of forget about until halfway through a story is that characters are most interesting when they can change, especially thinking about like webcomics. And my webcomic owl people, the characters change a lot, and they're most interesting when you give them a bit of room to do that. The initial characters I drew for owl people, I designed them when I was like 18 because they were characters I drew on my lecture notes at school, and like they've changed a lot since then, hopefully for the better, because some of the early conceptions were really kind of problematic. Just like letting them grow into being more interesting and giving them opportunities in the story to change in ways that maybe you've not 100% planned out, but you'll find out kind of who they grow into. is always really interesting to me. I don't like to plan too much because I get bored. So I try and leave myself gaps to let things change and not entirely know how they'll turn out. So that's always really interesting.
Things I always say in workshops is like, yeah, observation of real things is really important. And actually, I seem to remember when I was coming up with characters for Wool, I actually did a lot of just looking at other people's characters. And I was giving did a workshop, and I mentioned that, and I said, actually, this character, Sonia, in Wolf, who's Hugo's older sister, she was actually semi-inspired by a character in an animated film. Somebody in the audience went, it's the girl in The Incredibles, the one with her hair over her eyes. And I was like, rats, I didn't really cover that one up very well. I think it was only Sonia that was actually quite heavily influenced by a famous character. But usually just sort of always, I do a lot of just kind of messing around. So it could be doodling, or I will draw characters from different shapes, and I'll just play around with moving their features around. I'll look at people when we normally can look at people, you know, on tubes and stuff, and go, I really like that, and I might scribble something down. But I do find it quite useful, actually, just surfing on the internet a little bit, looking at photographs, looking at other people's characters, and then going, I really like that nose, and then carry on sketching and mess around with that, and playing around with caricature, extending, shrinking. I think people tend to get a little bit obsessed with faces. I think it's good to start playing around with body position straight away as well. Otherwise you get these sort of very stiff characters, and so I'll do a lot of just sort of slinking around and thinking about personality. And I really enjoyed doing the kids in Wolf, and there was Susie Q, who is ridiculously confident about how good looking and sexy she is. I think she was only supposed to be about 13 or 14, and she's neither of those things, but she had that confidence. And then because they've got that limited experience, what can they use to show off to somebody they fancy? And she really fancies Hugo's older brother. So I did lots of sketches of her doing back bends, because I thought, this is what she thinks would be really attractive to a boy, a girl who could do back bends. So yeah, I think it's all sorts of things, really. It's looking and thinking and playing. And then when your brain's not focused on trying, you tend to get these little liquid characters will kind of pop out of nowhere.
So I've been creating characters for decades since I was a child. I've definitely refined my method. I know it's very tricky. I think about the story first and what the story demands, because it's just my writing style. I always want to think about like, what's the message of my story, what's the function, and how can the characters portray these messages and ideas and themes. So that's the first thing that I think of before creating a character. And I, like in the more sort of fun ways of doing stuff, I'll always be doing sketches, I'll always be drawing the characters, refining them over time. Studying animation, I think, was also very helpful, because I know how to do like turnarounds for characters and expression sheets, gesture sheets and stuff like that, which is very good for just like refining the physicalities of the character as well. For example, like at the moment I'm developing a story called To Be Loved that has some really, really heavy themes, and I decided that I'm going to make all of the characters in this world like monsters and stuff, because I think that's easier for people to be able to relate to the characters if they're like not necessarily human. I think it's easier to like see yourself in a character, because if you have like a human that has like very specific characteristics, some people might have trouble seeing themselves in that position. And with the heavy themes of the comic, I want people to be able to see themselves there. I'm trying like not to spoil my own story. Yeah, I think it for the theme of the story and for the function of story and getting the story across to the people that I want to get it across to. That's why I've made that executive decision. So that's how like the story feeds directly like into the character design.
Yeah, well, if I'm creating a character, I often just start from somewhere that makes me happy to think about or interesting. I started out in fan fiction. That was where I did my first lot of writing, kind of adding to people's characterizations and backstory and whatever. And I have, as well as ADHD, I have a condition called dyspraxia, which is very similar to dyslexia, but it messes with your spatial awareness. So I'm really clumsy. I fall over a lot. I'm terrible at sports. So I had this idea of a kind of princess who really wanted to be the badass warrior woman. but she was incapable of it. She tried to learn how to fight with swords and ended up like stabbing the wall, but she never gets any better. Otherwise, she's persuasive or something. I think that's it. You've got to find your character's flaws and you've got to find what they're good at. You never want to create a Mary Sue, which is a massively overused term, by the way. A big thing for me is like, what is she good at and what is she bad at? So this person was just really bad at finding their way and anything physical, but they could talk their way out of absolutely anything. So they kind of compensated for that. Yeah, a lot of it is I often start with something I know, whether it's a character or a story or a trait like ADHD or dyspraxia, which I happen to know really well myself. I often start with where I want them to end up. I find it so much easier to build a backstory and be like, where I want to get here. It's sort of the opposite way from how I do my academic work, which is supposedly, here is a theory, is there evidence for it, test it, follow the evidence, etc. Change your mind a lot. Whereas here I'm like, okay, there's this person, they've got these traits. How did they get here? They're really surly and won't talk. Why is that? What happened? Why are they the person that they are? What flaws do they have? And then what things make them awesome? And if you can kind of figure those three things out, and then you start figuring out also how characters interact. If you want to write a romance or you want to write a buddy comedy or whatever, it only works if they can actually have interesting conversations with each other. I do a lot more academic work and a lot more editing, so character building's not my strength. That's how I go about it when I need to do it.
So I don't really spend much time doing character design, really. I just draw onto the page. I might do like one page, like one A4 of just kind of making sure I know exactly kind of whereabouts I'm going to put the eyes. And because I think for me, I don't really work particularly photographically. I don't work in terms of look for my reference to draw. I do it in my body. So I feel. So if I'm doing a smiley face or a sad face, I'll kind of just like do it on my face, but I won't necessarily look in the mirror. I'll just sort of feel it. And so it's kind of like that, really. It's kind of like with the people that I'm drawing, it's like kind of tuning into them and to not draw them in a way that's going to suggest something that they're not. I think that's something, because I did draw one character for like an orange, and I've just drawn him so big, and he doesn't look like, he was a big man, but the way I've drawn him, it just looks, there's like a different personality coming through that's not him. It's just not quite right, and I can't quite put my finger on it, but I just know it's not quite right. So I think that's important. I don't want to represent somebody with sort of like a personality essence that they don't have. I want the essence of somebody to come through, but not necessarily the physicality of them. I don't think it's that important that it looks like them, because it's going to be so subjective anyway. Yeah, I think an important rule of thumb is to keep it bare. Yeah, just not to embellish and not to add. To be really strict with the kind of dialogues, like, is that how that person spoke? Would they say it like that? And so therefore, to avoid guessing, just like don't do it. So just literally put what I remember, what I know is the case. I've interpreted this thing. So just make sure that's clear in the narrative.
There's not really a favourite way I approach something. I like to draw generally. I like to doodle. So I usually start off doodling and sketching. And I like, even though I would say I was more of a writer, planning out how I think a page might look. That's what I love about collaboration. A lot of the comics I've done have been very collaborative. And that's like my favourite thing, because I like doing layouts. To be honest, I do layouts and sort of thumbnails so I know I don't write too much, because I think it's annoying for an artist if a writer comes in and says, here's all of my words, and find a way to fit them all into 9 panels. So I do that to kind of reel myself in, so I know I'm not being horrible to the artist. But then, so I'll make like a rough layout, but then I'll always say to them, you're the artist. Like, if you think there's a better way to do this, then please bring that to the table. And sometimes they're like, no, I think that's good. And sometimes they think, oh, I actually think if we flip this. I'm always amazed at the way they bring their ideas to the table, because I love art and I've always liked drawing and stuff like that, but I wouldn't define myself as a comics artist. So when they bring something else, it always amazes me, and it's so exciting to collaborate and jump off each other and stuff like that. But even artists I've never worked with before, I find that so exciting as well, because you're learning new things about them. They might completely like a completely different genre to you, or a different style, and I love that. I look at my comics and think, well, I don't even think of them as my comics, because they're always so collaborative. They're our comics, and I think I could never have imagined that page like that, but I love what you've brought to it, like so different.